Thank you all for coming. My relationship with Amherst, as Megan said, goes back to 1983 when I came here to teach East Asian art, or Asian art in general. Increasingly, my work is in Japan and Japanese art, and increasingly I'm focusing more on Japan. It's wonderful to be able to talk to you in the museum, and the reason we're talking in the museum is in many ways because of Lizzie Barker and what Lizzie has been doing at the museum, and in particular what the museum has been doing to support the Amherst College curriculum. I have two colleagues in Japanese studies with whom I have constructed a course on the city of Tokyo. And we call the course Reinventing Tokyo because Tokyo has in many ways reinvented itself numerous times since 1868 when Japan entered into the modern era. And we wanted to invent a course that would introduce our students to a topic in Japanese studies. We wanted an introduction in Japanese studies. We have a terrific language program here that's headed by my colleague, Professor Wako Tawa. We get students who come to Amherst specifically to study Japanese language and to study Japanese culture. And we had this very strong language program, and we wanted a course that would introduce the students to Japanese studies. And so we devised this course on Tokyo among the three of us, the historian, the person who does literature, and me as the art historian, called Reinventing Tokyo. Just as we were having the discussions for this course, we had the fortunate opportunity of getting a new museum director. And the new museum director, Lizzie Barker, said, is there a way that we can think of an exhibition in conjunction with the course? And being an art historian, and I said, of course, there's always a way to think of an exhibition in conjunction with a class. And so over 3 years, I put together an exhibition proposal. And that exhibition proposal has been accepted, and in the fall of 2012, there is going to be an exhibition of the same title, Reinventing Tokyo, in the Mead, in conjunction with the class the next time I teach it with Tim Van Compernol in Japanese literature. He's on leave next year, so we're taking 1 year off from the class. I've taught it twice with Professor Trent Maxey in history. But we'll teach it for the third time, and on the occasion of the third time, we will have this glorious exhibition. In thinking about preparing for the exhibition, and this is where sort of the wonderful kinds of collaboration that can take place at a small college actually happened. In thinking about the exhibition, we realized that the Mead did not have a large collection of objects to support the exhibition. And so one of the first things that Lizzie Barker did was she said, let's see if we can acquire some objects to support this exhibition. And so in 2008, is that right? I think it's 2008. I can look at the print to get the right number. In 2008, yes, we acquired 65 objects to use in our teaching and to use as a kind of core group of objects for this exhibition. And I thought it would be a lot more interesting for you to see real works of art than for me to talk about slides. So this has literally transformed what we can do with the teaching of Japan in the 20th century here at the Mead Museum and here at Amherst College. Slides are good in the classroom, but the actual work of art, of course, as you all know, is just so much better. I also have been supported, and this course has also been supported by the library. The library has started buying objects to support the course and support the exhibition as well. And so we had brought over from the library a recent acquisition that we just got this winter, and I will bring you all up and you can look at that as well. But what we want to do in this class is talk about how the city of Kyoto is constantly changing, or has constantly changed from 1868, when Japan enters into the modern era, as I said, all the way up to the present. And so the exhibition is going to begin with a group of prints that we're going to borrow from Oberlin College that shows Japan in the 1850s, that shows the city of Tokyo. It was known as Edo then. in the 1850s. And then we're going to start looking at how the city changes. And of the acquisitions that we have, the first artist that we're really going to focus on, whose work I have here today, is an artist who's named Kobayashi Kiyochika. And Kiyochika is really a kind of paradigm for the transformation of Japan in the 1870s and the 1880s. He's born into this old world, but he leaves the city in 1868 and comes back into the city in the early 1870s. And in the early 1870s, he makes the acquaintance of an Englishman who is in Tokyo and who is there for publishing something sort of like the Illustrated London News. Kobayashi Kiyochika had no interest in art prior to meeting this Englishman, but this Englishman teaches him about watercolor, and watercolor is something that is totally unknown in Japan at the time. The Japanese would paint with monochromatic ink, but the Western methods of watercolor were completely unknown. And Kobayashi Kiyochika gets fascinated by watercolor technique, but watercolor isn't a medium that the Japanese are used to, and so he adapts watercolor technique to the technique of woodblock printing. And he produces from 1878 up until about 1881, he produces hundreds of woodblock prints that use watercolor techniques to show the changing face of the city. And the first three prints that we have up here are Kobayashi Kiyochika prints that are done in this new sort of mode, this new way that of thinking about landscape, of thinking about the city. And I think you can see the watercolor influence probably best in the third print, the print of a bridge on the eastern edge of the city called Ryogoku Bridge. And if you look at the way he does the sky with layers of purple overlaid over blue in ways that a traditional woodblock print artist of the earlier part of the 19th century or even the 18th century would never have done. And he also incorporates Western perspective into his woodblock prints as well. So here we see Kobayashi Kiyochika taking watercolor techniques, taking a perspectival system, and adapting it to the woodblock print technique. He's very interested in famous places, sort of well-known places in the city of Tokyo. One of those well-known places is Mount Otago. This is sort of the highest spot in the city. It's where you could actually look down over Tokyo. And so what he shows us here is a tea room that has been built on the top of Mount Otago. And Mount Otago isn't really very much of a mountain. It's about 300 feet in height, but it does afford a view down into the city. And what I think is so wonderful about this print is that it shows the process of transformation, particularly in the modes of dress of the residents of the city in 1880 or 1881. So we see the tea shop girl here, she's dressed in a kimono, but we see a patron who's wearing a bowler hat, he's wearing a Western style coat, he has climbed up the mountain, he has climbed to the top of Mount Otago, he is about to get a cup of tea, and they're looking down on the city. I can't figure out why there are chickens in the image. There are these three chickens down at the bottom of the image, and they are a mystery to me, but this is a place that shows up in earlier prints. It continues to get illustrated, and this is very much one of the city of Edo's famous places. The first print, the print that you see on the far left, is of the Nihonbashi Bridge. And the Nihonbashi Bridge was the bridge that was right down in the center of the city of Edo, Tokyo. It was the place where all roads that left the capital city were said to emanate from. So if you were going north, you would start from Nihonbashi. If you were going south and west to the city of Kyoto, You would start from Nihonbashi as well. In modern Japan, it's sort of the topographical center. The geodetic survey in Japan measures everything from Nihonbashi as well. So it too is a famous spot in the city of Tokyo. It was famous in the 17th and 18th century, but what is particularly wonderful about this print is that Kobayashi Kiyochika is showing us Nihonbashi at night. And Kobayashi Kiyochika got really, really interested in the fact that he could do night scenes, informed by watercolor and etching. Night scenes were something that rarely showed up in Japanese art prior to the 1880s. Kobayashi Kiyochika thinking about the idea of gaslights, thinking about the idea of lanterns and oil lanterns, incorporates light into his pictures over and over again. And because he's so fascinated by light, many of his prints are done of night scenes, of scenes in the dark, where he can emphasize the new light, the new technologies that are coming into the city. And so if you look at this print, and one of the things, I'm going to talk for maybe half an hour or so, and then I want you to get up and come and look at the actual objects. You can see the street lamps going down the main street in the city of Tokyo, going into the distance. You can see rickshaw drivers who are holding lanterns. There is a horse-drawn carriage that has lanterns on it as well. And if you look really carefully at the silhouettes, these sort of ghostly black figures, you can see some are dressed in traditional garments and some are dressed in Western-style garments. So Kobayashi Kiyochika is really capturing this transformation of the city in the 1880s as gas lights and eventually electricity come into the city of Tokyo. And accounts of Tokyo before the 1860s and 70s are that at night it was a city that was very, very dark. And I think we can imagine what life was like before computers. We can imagine what life was like before radio and television. Imagine Japan before electricity and before gas lights. And it was just a very, very different world. And so for Kobayashi Kiyochika, the fact that Edo, now Tokyo, can be lit up at night is something that he really wants to incorporate into his prints, and we're really fortunate to have this print. I can tell you just another story about these prints. When Lizzie Barker said we could acquire some prints, I went and got in touch with a dealer friend of mine in New York, and he said he would find prints for the Mead, and he got us truly, truly wonderful impressions of all the prints that we were able to acquire. So when you come up and when you look at these prints, look at the purples. The purple of the man's coat, the purple in the sunset here on Ryogoku Bridge, and if you look very, very carefully in the far distance of this print that otherwise is gray and yellow, there's this tiny, tiny bit of purple. So not only were we able to acquire images that in terms of their content are wonderful, but we were able to acquire images that in terms of their physical quality are wonderful as well. So one of the things that makes Kobayashi Kiyochika someone great to use in an exhibition and great to use in the classroom is that after this period of Westernization where he's sort of infatuated with the West, he reverts and he goes back and does a series of prints in a far more traditional style. And so what we see here are three prints that he does in the middle part of the 1880s that he does in the style of the great landscape printmaker Hiroshige, who did the series 100 Views of Edo that were completed in 1858. So he sort of gives up the watercolor techniques. He goes back to traditional techniques of sort of the tonal gradations in the sky. You can see that he's more or less giving up cast shadows. He's giving up light sources, and he's putting in traditional cartouches and signing his name in a traditional way. But what's interesting is that while on the one hand then he's reverting back to Japanese modes of representation, Japanese perspectival systems, the changing city is still the subject of his pictures. So if one looks, this is exactly the same scene. Here done in the early 1880s, here done in the middle 1880s, these stakes were put in for erosion control along the banks of the Sumida River. So he's showing us the same scene, but what does he keep in this image? A Western-style factory that is belching smoke. And so on the one hand, this is his sort of nostalgic view of the old world. But on the other hand, the new world is so insistently there in Tokyo in the 1880s that Kobayashi Kiyochika chooses to show it. The same thing is true in this picture, and this is a picture from Nihonbashi, so the same location that we have in the first print, looking westward towards Mount Fuji. And we see a fishmonger, the great fish market. Some of you have probably been to Tokyo and have gotten up early in the morning and gone to the Tsukiji fish market and seen the tuna auctions. That's more or less in the general neighborhood of Nihonbashi. So we see a fishmonger here with this wonderful tattoo, but as we look off into the distance, right in front of Mount Fuji, and in fact as tall as Mount Fuji in the print, is a brick building. So is a Western-style building. And if we move to the third image from this series, we're looking at an island at the mouth of the Sumida River, right at the very top of Tokyo Bay. And we're looking at traditional-style warehouses. We're looking at most of the people in the image are dressed for some kind of festival, including this man with this absolutely glorious kimono that he's wearing. But what kind of bridge is it? The wooden bridge, the traditional bridge, has been replaced by a steel frame bridge. And so in each one of these images, he is incorporating the new along with the old. He's also making reference to a Hiroshige print of exactly the same subject matter and commenting on that print as well. So we're going to at least begin part of the exhibition with these prints by Kobayashi Kiyochika. I found a wonderfully generous Williams graduate who is a collector of 19th century Japanese photography, a man who lives in New York, and he is being very, very generous. The first thing he said to me was, I don't know if I really want to do something at Amherst College, but that was just the usual joking, not having gone to either Amherst or Williams. I got through the usual joking. He's going to lend us some truly magnificent 19th century Japanese photographs that we will juxtapose with this group of prints that the Mead Art Museum has acquired. There were fires in Japan in Tokyo in the 1880s, but the great traumatic event in Tokyo was the great Kanto Earthquake of 1923. So if the trauma of the most recent earthquake and tsunami and nuclear meltdown is a trauma that the Japanese have experienced many times before. 1994 in the Kobe earthquake, 1923 was an earthquake that devastated the entire city of Tokyo. Over 100,000 people died. Yokohama burned, 40 to 60% of Tokyo burned. And a printmaker named Hiratsuka Unichi did a series of prints of Tokyo after the great earthquake. And we've been able to acquire 6 from the series of 12, and I've just put up 2 of them here to show you. Hiratsuka comes out of a different kind of world of printmaking. By the 1920s, Japanese artists were interested in a more expressionistic style. And so Hiratsuka Unichi, along with all the other printmakers that we see here, with the exception of this man here, he carved his own blocks and he did his own printing. Traditionally, prints would be drawn, the image would be drawn, the picture would be given to a block carver who would carve the block, the blocks would be given to a printer who would do the printing, and then the publisher would sell the image. But in the 20s, particularly influenced by German Expressionism, artists got interested in doing the whole process themselves. And Hiratsuka was a very important figure in this movement that is known as the creative print movement. And one of his important series was this early series from the 1924 of Tokyo after the Great Earthquake. So we see the banks of the Sumida River. This is not the same metal steel frame bridge that we see in Kobayashi Kiyochika's print, but it is a similar one. We see buildings that have burned. We see trees that have burned, telephone poles without their wires. Immediately next to it, we see the National Athletic Stadium that was built in the early 20s, prior to the earthquake, as a place to hold sumo tournaments. As Japan was sort of asserting its own national identity, sumo became one of those symbols of its national identity. It was one of the few buildings that did not get destroyed, but there was a huge conflagration right next to it where in a period of just a couple hours, over 30,000 people died. But what do we see here? So here is the modern building that is relatively untouched. We see some refugee camps, buildings built out of wood, some tents. What I think is particularly interesting is there is a great temple bell there, and that bell somehow made its way to the grounds of the National Athletic Complex. And Hiratsuka is showing it to us, and you can see, we see a lot more of his line quality, we see a lot more of his mark on the surface of the paper. It's a very different kind of image than the first 6 that we are looking at. What's interesting is we can compare then Tokyo in 1923, right after the earthquake, and Tokyo as it has been revitalized after 1931. It took 8 years for the city to recover. And in 1931, there is a festival, a grand celebration commemorating the rebuilding and the reopening of the city. And so what do we see here? This is a print artist whose name is Koizumi Kobayashi. He's an artist who has been relatively unknown in Japan until a collector in Boston, a man named Fred Scharf, got interested in Koizumi Kishio's 100 Views of New Tokyo. And now, because of interest in the West, Japanese are getting more interested in Koizumi's vision of the new city, the rebuilt city. And Koizumi does a series of 100 prints of the city between the early 1930s and the early 1940s. And so now we see the restored National Athletic Stadium. We see a sumo wrestler here. We see a car that's going into the stadium, and this tower is a sort of legacy of the past. The sumo tournaments would be announced from a tall wooden tower in the pre-modern era, and that still shows up in this print as well. Immediately next to it is another print from the series that also shows the new face of the city. One of the most important sort of cultural and commercial institutions in the new Tokyo was the department store. And if any of you have been to the Ginza or been to Nihonbashi, the Mitsukoshi department store is sort of the Harrods of Japan. And the Mitsukoshi department store put out posters, it advertised itself, and it became this important cultural monument in the rebuilt city. And so what Koizumi is showing us in this print is the new rebuilt Mitsukoshi department store and the Mitsui Bank. So we see the bank done in a kind of Western style. We see the department store, and then we see the various new modes of transportation in the city. And my colleague Trent Maxey is particularly interested in how Tokyo transforms by the automobile. And so we see a taxi, a private car, we see someone on a bicycle, and then we see a bus in the background. But this print is very much a celebration of the new city, as is these 4 images here that are part of a collaborative series. 10 different artists in this creative print movement joined together, and they each produced 10 images of the city in another series of 100 prints. And the whole idea of 100 goes back to Hiroshige's 100 Famous Views of Edo from 1856 to 1858. So the idea of doing a series of 100 is not something new, but has its roots in traditional print culture. So 10 different artists, each producing 10 different images. Many of the sets have been broken up, and again, we've been very, very fortunate to be able to buy a group of, I think, particularly wonderful ones from this set. So we can begin with this image by Maeda Senpan, and we see a man in a great sort of Western-style overcoat. He's wearing a Western-style hat, and he's looking out over the new city. We can think of this as sometime in the mid-1930s then. And he's looking out at a department store, and if you come up and look at this, you'll see little bits of red. Neon lights are the new thing in the city of Tokyo in the 1930s. And print after print after print has neon lights. It's sort of building on what Kobayashi Kiyochika was thinking about in the 1880s as the city gets lighter and lighter at night. And again, if you go to Japan, those of you who've been to Japan, you know that night and day in Japan, there's so much light in Japan at night that sometimes you just wonder, and I think the Japanese are beginning to wonder how they can support all that consumption of electricity. But each of these images then is showing the new face of the city. So we see Tokyo Station in this print by Onchi Koshiro, station that was built or completed around 1912 to be the terminus of the railway going to the south and the east. But what we see in this image are what in Japan came to be known as modern girls, essentially flappers in a Japanese style. So people with short hair wearing Western style clothes. And of course, there's always the juxtaposition between the women in Western style clothes and the woman under the green parasol is wearing a kimono. New kinds of activities in the city. So burlesque shows and theater. And there in the Asakusa district was something called the Casino Folie, a kind of live performance. And so what do we see here? Again, done in a style that's very much influenced by German Expressionism by an artist named Kawakami Sumio, who just loves these intense pinks in his prints. But we see a theatrical performance on stage, and then the various people in the audience all wearing different kinds of hats. That I think, again, is sort of capturing the mood of the city, the hedonism of the city in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. And then this last print here makes an interesting juxtaposition with this print here because it's, again, the northern end of Tokyo Bay, this place called Tsukudajima. But what has happened to it by the early 1930s, it's turned completely into an industrial complex. And we see one sort of lone figure here out on a pier looking out at the industry of the new city. We see a tugboat pulling barges. But what's also very, very interesting, the sort of new world of pleasure, the new world of entertainment, there is one figure in a powerboat. So like a Chris Craft powerboat going in the opposite direction. So again, the sort of world of leisure, the world of pleasure of the new city is captured in each of these images here. So when you come up and look, I have 3 more images from the set on the table, but let me now talk about what is up here, and then you can come up and look, and we can continue this conversation. So this is our most recent acquisition for the exhibition. The first time I taught the class with Trent Maxey, the group of pictures that the students were most excited by were a group of photographs by an artist whose last name is Kikai. And Kikai has gone to a temple in Kyoto weekly for the last 20 to 30 years and taken photographs of the people who come and visit that temple. And this is not downtown in the commercially thriving part of the city, but it's in a part of the city that was very popular in the 1920s, but now is more or less forgotten. It's a part of the city that is known as Asakusa. And so people who are somewhat on the margins of the new Japanese miracle of expanding economies and big buildings are the people who visit Asakusa Temple. And Kikai goes and he gets the people that he finds in the temple grounds, and it has a shopping district around it. Well, he gets them to pose for a portrait photograph. And so he has probably, over his career, done 300 to 400 portraits of people that he poses against one of the temple walls. And so you can see the vertical pillar and the horizontal support. And this is a photograph of a man who says that he is a Buto actor, a particularly sort of exotic kind of contemporary Japanese theatrical performance. But the first time we taught the course, it was Kikis Portraits from Asakusa that absolutely captured the imagination of the students. They fell in love with Kikis portraits. So, of course, I went to Lizzie and I said, can we acquire a Kikai portrait? Because the students really, really respond to these Kikai portraits. There happens to be a dealer in New York City, and so I got in touch with the dealer in New York, and we were going to do it. The students all dispersed. We were going to get the students to try to participate in the selection of the image, but by the time we got ready to purchase the image, the students in that class, most had graduated. So Lizzie and I picked this image to add to the museum's collection, to add to the images that we're going to put in the exhibition. But it's, I just think it is a phenomenal picture. There's this man standing with these strange glasses. He's standing up against the temple. 2 students in that first iteration of the course, 2 students wrote their final papers on Kikai's Asakusa portraits. And so we're really, really fortunate. This came, what, Stephen, 2 weeks ago, right? Yeah, so we've only had this image for 2 weeks. So you are the first public audience to see this image. A few years earlier, we were able to acquire 2 photographs by an artist whose last name is Shibata, who is probably best known in this country. He has a lot of works in museum collections in this country, looking down over Hoover Dam. If any of you have been to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, they have an absolutely huge one. Shibata got his start, though, traveling around the Japanese landscape and looking for incongruities of man's impact on nature in Japan. And again, it's a very different way of thinking about the Japanese landscape than we're used to. And I was hoping that we could acquire some of these Shibata photographs to juxtapose them against landscape prints, particularly from the 19th century, Hiroshige landscape prints and Hokusai landscape prints. And so the museum acquired these 2 photographs. This is a mountainside with this very, very precarious stairway. I'm not sure what it is going up to, but you would never imagine, in this steep mountainside, a steel stairway going up. And of course, it's Japan, it's spring, so there are cherry blossoms. Shibata crops his photographs so one has no real sense of orientation within the image, where one is, what one is looking at. And this works particularly well with the cherry blossoms in sort of a new way of thinking about Japanese landscape, a new way of thinking about cherries in Japan. The other thing that one discovers if one goes to Japan and goes out into the natural world is how much the impact of human beings have had on the natural landscape in Japan. When we read about the tsunami, we read about the great concrete barriers that are built along the Japanese coast that did absolutely no good. But if you go into the mountains, you will find concrete retaining walls, you'll find all sorts of odd, different kinds of public work projects to stop erosion, to stop landslides. Shibata has taken this photograph of a river that is filled with concrete tetrapods to stop erosion. So think of the stakes along the Ryogoku River in its late 20th century manifestation. So we look down in this inky river, and he's printed it, I think, so the water shows particularly dark, and we see some naturally occurring rocks, but most of what we are looking at are these odd geometric forms. So it's, again, this sort of incongruity of the activities, the traces of humans on what otherwise is a natural landscape, and we have no way really to orient ourselves into where we are looking. He's cropping the picture off in in a very, very interesting way, it seems to me. When we purchased these two photographs, we were given the photograph that we see on the far left. This is a photograph by another photographer who is relatively well known in the West. His last name is Tomatsu. He had an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco and Japan Society a few years ago called Skin of the Nation. Tomatsu started out as a journalist photographer. In 1960, he was asked to go to Nagasaki to document the legacy of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. And he produced a book called Nagasaki 1102, which I'm very happy to say the library just bought a first edition of. In that book is this image of a wristwatch that was uncovered from the aftermath of the atomic bombing, and I believe is now in a museum in Nagasaki itself. So the dealer who sold us these two photographs gave us this photograph as a gift because he thought it would have a good home here for us to use in our teaching. So it is, I think, a very, very powerful reminder of the destructive qualities of the atomic bomb, and the way Tomatsu is photographed of it with this sort of flash in the background, to me, is particularly effective. Over here on the right-hand side, another gift from another Amherst graduate. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, an artist named Yokos, his last name Yokos, got very interested in pop art, American pop art, and he sort of reinterpreted American pop art into a Japanese context. This is an advertising poster for a theatrical performance that took place in the mid-1960s. Koshimaki Osen means Osen in petticoats, and it was a sort of an experimental outdoor theater performance done by a group that called themselves the Red Tent. And what he has put together here is a kind of pastiche. I think you can recognize some things, the peach, something that we associate with Japan, and there's the story of the peach boy or Momotaro. So we see a peach, we see the bullet train in its earliest incarnation. The bullet train opens up in 1964 for the Tokyo Olympics. We see the bullet train, we see him borrowing from the Rolling Stones here, the lips and the tongue. We see the great wave of Hiroshige. We see the flag of the Japanese Navy, the rectangular shape with the flower in it is a set of Japanese playing cards that gives a description of what the performance is going to be all about. And then Yoko has these strange naked women wearing helmets. That's something else I haven't quite figured out yet either. But this is very much, so if you sort of think Andy Warhol and you think someone who is part of this same world working in Japan at the same time that Warhol is working in the United States, that's what we're looking at here. Again, each and every one of these objects allows me and my colleagues, Catherine Epstein, who teaches a course on the Second World War, brings her class to look at this wristwatch from the Nagasaki 1102 series. It allows faculty from a range of disciplines to come and actually teach with actual objects. We had a visiting faculty member teaching contemporary art for the first time in a long time in the art department this past spring. She had never seen Yoko's things. We have 6 of them downstairs in storage, and when she was looking through storage to figure out things to teach with, she came across the Yoko stuff. She got them all brought up here, and she and I taught a course together that combined her greater knowledge of pop art and the Western traditions, and then I could put the Yoko posters in context. Yoko is important. He's the first Japanese artist to have an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So he's a relatively significant figure, and we're lucky to have these posters here as well. Tokyo continues to reinvent itself. If you've been to Tokyo recently, you've probably been to Roppongi Hills. They tore down a huge neighborhood to build this new complex that has the Mead Art Museum at the top. So Tokyo is in this constant process of transformation. Because of that, it's a wonderful subject for a class, but it also needs to be documented. We have a lot of artists who are documenting it for us, and we're fortunate that we're able to acquire some of the work by those artists to use in exhibitions, to use in teaching at the Mead Museum. So I'd love for you to all come up, because you need to look at these objects close up, and I'm also happy to answer questions.
Why did Edo change its name?
Because they moved the emperor, who had been in Kyoto, to the east, and they wanted a sort of a more formal sounding name that did not have the vestiges of the previous government, the Tokugawa government. So Edo was the name given to the city by the Tokugawas, and Tokyo means eastern capital, and so when they moved the emperor eastward, there was some thought of perhaps having two capitals, a traditional capital in Kyoto and a modern capital in Tokyo. That idea was abandoned, but the name Tokyo stuck.
Thank you.
How much of the city was destroyed in the American firebombing, and so is it
just
new?
Just about as much as was destroyed in the Great Kanto Earthquake. And in both cases, the area east of the river, essentially this huge residential area, it's where this is. That's the area, lots of wooden houses in both occasions. That's the area that burned both times. So 100,000 people were killed in both events. And essentially the same proportion of the city burned.
What made 1868 such a transitional number?
1868 was just the year when the people in the domains in Western Japan organized and essentially installed this young emperor of 16 as the symbol of a new and modern Japan. So 1868 marks the end of the Edo period, the end of Tokugawa rule that had begun in the early 17th century and had lasted till 1868, and the beginning of Japan embarking on this unprecedented process of modernization and westernization that ended, you know, it's remarkable if you think that here's a country, no electricity, no trains, totally a pre-modern society, and in 1905 they go to war against the Russians and they sink the entire Russian fleet in the Battle of Tsushima. You know, and that's less than 40 years. I mean, which is one of the reasons why it's such a fascinating subject for study as well, because the Japanese were very systematic about it. They wanted to learn about Western-style universities. So first, as early as 1860, I don't know if any of you saw, some of you must be New Yorkers, and the Museum of the City of New York had a really, really interesting exhibition last fall on the first Japanese mission to New York, which took place in 1860. But they went overseas to learn, and then they brought Americans and Europeans to teach them how to do different things. So they turned to Germany as a source for their universities. They turned to the United States as a source for agriculture. They got this man named William Clark, an Amherst College graduate who was associated with the agriculture school at the University of Massachusetts. He barely spent any time in Japan. I don't think he did much, but the one thing he did do, he was up in the northern island of Hokkaido, and he said, "Boys, be ambitious," to a group of Japanese future farmers of Japan. And that phrase sort of stuck as a slogan for modernization and westernization. So every Japanese school child knows who William Clark is because William Clark said, "Boys, be ambitious." Every Japanese school, if I ask my students what important event happened in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, they have no idea. You know, the Treaty of Portsmouth is meaningless to most American, you know, even Amherst College students. But every Japanese school child knows about Portsmouth, New Hampshire, because that's where the peace treaty was signed in 1906 with the Russians after the Russo-Japanese War. Question?
Would you comment on the influence of someone like Ernest Fenollosa on this
So
work?
Fenollosa is...
got all that work to the Boston...
So Fenollosa is part of they were called Yatoijin, these Americans who were hired by the Japanese to teach. Fenollosa was hired to teach political philosophy at Tokyo University, but he had studied aesthetics with Charles Eliot Norton. He got to Japan, he started lamenting the fact that the Japanese were westernizing and modernizing so quickly, and he suggested that the way for the Japanese to preserve traditional culture was to incorporate certain Western elements into traditional culture, but maintain traditional culture as well. So he became, you know, very interesting, he became the great spokesperson for the preservation of Japanese culture. He then had this disciple, this man named Okakura Kakuzo, and Okakura was the son of a merchant, but Okakura was brought up, his English was always better than his Japanese. Okakura became a curator of Japanese art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Boston was very special because Boston was far more interested in sort of learning about Japan, both in Japan and from the Japanese. So William Sturgis Bigelow goes to Japan, lives in Japan for 10 years, amasses a collection of 50,000 woodblock prints, brings them back, gives them to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He gives hundreds of paintings to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The Museum of Fine Arts then brings Okakura Kakuzo to be curator. So if you think that a Japanese person is curator of Japanese art in Boston, that doesn't happen anywhere else in this country until well probably into the 1970s, maybe the 1960s. But it's just a whole, you know, two-generation difference. Ananda Kumaraswamy, who is an Anglo-Indian, is curator of Indian art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in the pre-war period as well. So Boston was very much in the forefront of an appreciation of Japanese art in Japanese terms, not the kinds of objects that were sent to the expositions that the Japanese were sending to Philadelphia. You can see some of those at the Wadsworth Atheneum, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis. It's a whole different category of art. Yes?
In 1959 or 1960, Leo Marx published a book called The Machine in the Garden, and he drew his image from a meditative moment in Walden, a nostalgic moment.
Mm-hmm.
My sense of the intrusion of industrialism into these Japanese prints, as you have presented them, is that there is no sense of nostalgia, no real sense of something lost, something being replaced by modern industrialism. One possible exception from my point of view here, the one on the right, that landscape looks so impressionist, that sky, yes.
This one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it looks so impressionistic to me that there might be some kind of sentimental dimension in the thing. But do the Japanese lament the loss of their wooden bridge, their urban scape? I mean, these...
There certainly is a world of... There is nostalgia. The nostalgia shows up probably best if you're interested in a nostalgic sentiment about the loss of traditional culture. There is something called In Praise of Shadows, written by the novelist Junichiro Tanizaki. And it's an essay that he wrote in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And it's an essay about what has been lost as Western culture moves into Japan. we can't figure out whether Tanizaki was playing it straight. No one seems to know, the specialists. Whether he was playing it straight in this text or whether it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek. But I think what the Japanese ended up doing was that they realized that for them not to be colonized, for them to become world players, they needed to westernize, they needed to modernize. And so they lodged their national identity in the aesthetic. They lodged their national identity in certain cultural practices that they saw as distinctively Japanese. The tea ceremony, for example. So Okakura Kakuzo, the same man who became curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, wrote in 1906 in English something called the Book of Tea that became the most influential. It's the first book on Japanese art ever to be written in a Western language. It was written by a Japanese in English. It was based on lectures he gave to Isabella Stewart Gardner. This became, in many ways, the statement of what Japanese aesthetics and Japanese culture was like for the entire pre-war period in English. So people like Wallace Stevens, John Paul Sartre, a whole range of intellectuals, their experience of Japan was the Book of Tea. So the Japanese themselves are sort of positing national identity, how they can draw themselves or separate themselves from the West in the world of the aesthetic, in cultural practices, because they are dressing in Western clothes, they're going to war in Western warships, they are riding steam engines, that railroad trains that are invented in the West. So it's the cultural that remains the place where identity is maintained.
And what about another influence coming from Arthur Wesley Dow, Penalosa's friend, with that book composition that just sweeps across the country?
Right. Arthur Wesley Dow goes to Japan. John Lafarge goes to Japan. They bring all this back.
But that book.
The book, yes. And so you get places like the Rookwood Pottery in Cincinnati, and they're making ceramics. It's all coming out of the Northeast. And it really is coming out of this world of Boston and Salem more than anywhere else.
Let's see the pictures.
Pardon? Yeah, come up and look at the pictures.